everyone, I welcome you all to another video by Legacy IAS, where we're going to talk about how we see our Indian constitution vis-a-vis the constitution of Germany, which is also called the Weimar Constitution. Now, as far as this particular discussion is concerned, it is something that will help us understand the friendship between these two nations, some things which are just fundamentally in sync, that kind of help or provide a starting point for countries to get together and also have a stronger relationship for future. In that respect, let us look at the different provisions which are there of the German constitution, which are similar to the Indian ones, and also the differences which are there between the fundamental principles of these two countries. We also know the fact that India has borrowed some features from the constitution of Germany, and that is also an important part of our discussion today. So now, as far as the borrowings from Germany is concerned, the principles that India has borrowed from Germany, we need to primarily begin our understanding with the fact that if you look at the Weimar Constitution of Germany, it came in the backdrop of the First World War. After the First World War of 1999, the one which we have seen actually leading to destruction starting from 1914 to 1919. The backdrop of this particular war actually was the one responsible for Germany coming up with its own constitution. This particular constitution, in that sense, because it is coming from the background of the World War, is focusing upon human rights, free speech, and a commitment to both democracy as well as parliamentarism. In respect with India, we see that India in 1919 was of course still under the British, very much trying to just find a space for itself through different reforms, Government of India acts, and finally when it got independence, it also transformed itself into a parliamentary form of government and grew as a nation only in 1947. So in that respect, there is a great amount of time that we're looking as far as these two constitutions are concerned. So we actually had a template, something to borrow from Germany, and that was some of the provisions relating to emergency and the powers of the president. So here when we look at the powers of the president, we actually see that India, the way in which we have these division of the powers of the president as executive powers, legislative, judicial, okay, administrative powers, all of these kind of have some amount of influence from the German constitution. So in that sense, we have a starting point of our discussion today in terms of the understanding, the similarity, and also the way in which we have borrowed from Germany. Now, as far as the similarities that are there between the Indian and the Weimar Constitution, both these nations, and rather the constitutions of both these nations, have been influenced by the French Revolution. The French Revolution actually inspired, for example, the Indian Constitution in matters of the way in which its main principles of liberty, fraternity, okay, equality was basically introduced and even mentioned in the preamble of the Indian Constitution. The same way these principles are also influencing the Weimar Constitution, and they are also standing for the same principles espoused by the French Revolution. In both these nations of India and Germany, we have the head of the state who is elected, which is making both these nations a republic. So republic is where the head of the state is elected, and that makes both the nations representative. In India, of course, it's indirect, but still the fact that it is elected kind of make India representative and representative democracy. So this kind of a system is similar in both these nations. Both the nations have a parliamentary form of government. Now, parliamentary form of government is slightly different from the US system, whereby the executive and the legislature are in close sync with each other. For example, in India, you see that the government sits primarily in the lower house of the parliament and is responsible for the lower house, to the lower house, with respect to all its actions and the legislative policies. So, the same way here, we have the Chancellor or the Prime Minister as the head of the government, and the President having ceremonial powers or supervisory duties. So, just like in India, you have a de facto head and a de jure head, whereby the real power lies with the Council of Ministers headed by the Prime Minister. In the same way, there is a Chancellor or a Prime Minister at the head of the government in Germany to look after and decide the major affairs for the country. And we have a ceremonial head having supervisory duties as the president, just like in India, we have signatory powers being given to the president. The He acts actually according to the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers headed by the Prime Minister. So, in that sense, that is also an important area of similarity. Both the nations have a federal system, which means that there is some amount of division of power between the center and the different federating units. All right, so that is same and similar between both Indian and Weimar constitutions. Since both of them arise out of some great amount of violence and rights and freedom not being given to its people. Fundamental rights happen to be an important feature of both these nations. So, for example, the Weimar Constitution has guaranteed a lot of fundamental civil rights as well as liberty to its people, including the freedom of speech, assembly, and religion. These are the same things which are quite similarly given in the Indian Constitution under the different fundamental rights which have been provided, so essential to human existence as far as the Indian Constitution is concerned, because both of us have had experience of some kind of war and a prolonged conflict. All right, so that has had a major bearing on both of our constitutions. The Weimar Constitution also brings in gender equality and abolishes death penalty. So, gender equality, or rather, in India, you have a different way of putting it, support for women, giving affirmative, okay, discrimination. So in that sense, how women always, or rather in large ways, come as an exception to the major rules that have been created, only to recognize that they have been discriminated for years together, and we are trying to bring in some amount of gender equality in this journey. So keeping all of this in mind, that is another similarity that we see as far as the two constitutions are concerned. Both of them provide for a system of government where the party which is holding a majority is not allowed to abuse its power. So, with great power comes great responsibility. All right, that is the motto, rather than you have abuse of power. Now, if we look at the German constitution, they've had the history of how, very a leader which actually turned unpopular in great ways and has actually abused his power, according to many political critics, who, of course, I'm sure you know him by the name of Hitler. So he was someone who actually made a lot of abuse of power, and both actually provide a system whereby this abuse of power is limited. In India as well, the fact that you have a constitution which is limiting or restricting the powers of the government in its executive or its legislative functions speaks volumes about how you're trying to restrain, or how you're trying to avoid or put an end to this abuse of power. So that's another area of convergence, which shows that the basic elements, the values and the ethics which are there between these two countries and the constitutions of these two countries remain the same. But after all said and done, there are also some major differences which are there between the two constitutions. One is that Germany is a rigid constitution, whereas India is much flexible comparatively, even though it is also a rigid constitution in some sense. Now, the idea is that it is quite difficult to change the German constitution, which makes it rigid. It's only when you add the element of change and amendment can you make constitution flexible. Now, as far as Indian constitution is concerned, as far as the evolution is concerned, we have seen that how a lot of features of the constitution have undergone a change. Some have been repealed, some have been added and subtracted, but the basic structure of the constitution remains the same according to the judiciary, which cannot be violated. All right, so in that sense, those features actually become very, very rigid. But besides that, if you have the necessary majority, you can have an amendment to the constitution. So comparatively, it's much easier. Comparatively, it's much likely that the Indian constitution can undergo change as compared to the German constitution. Now, as far as citizenship is concerned, India stands for single citizenship. Okay, India is a country which has had the horrors of not just partition but also integration of these princely states, the reorganization of the states, and it has really had a tough time trying to bring these countries together and unify them in creating a single citizenship. All right, so once you kind of disturb that, it is expected to disturb the entire federal fabric of the country. But in the case of Germany, you have instances of dual citizenship being allowed in some circumstances. If we look at the two constitutions in general, we see that the Weimar Constitution is much more conservative as compared to the Indian Constitution, which, according to some political scientists, is far more progressive. It's much more dynamic and subject to change. It is open to change. All right, the Weimar Constitution focuses much more on individual rights, whereas the Indian Constitution focuses upon social justice. So, here, if we see that the background of the Indian economy, for that matter, has been mixed economy, whereby we've had instances of state having control over a lot of areas, but yet we have had instances of private individual ownership and entrepreneurship. Over the years, the way in which post globalization the state has transformed itself, we see a much limited role for the state, whereby social justice and providing a safety net is more like a primary function which the government of India performs. This is very different from the Weimar Constitution, which particularly focuses upon what an individual needs for his or her survival, and that is individual rights. So, in that sense, philosophically, also there has been some major difference in terms of the Indian and Weimar constitutions. So, in that respect, I hope you have benefited from the discussion and you have developed that perspective needed in terms of understanding that where fundamentally these two countries can be different because you have different constitutions, but there are much more areas of convergences which can be leveraged to bring this partnership much closer and stronger. So, in that respect, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for joining us.